It is not a matter of how much you can hit, but how much you can get hit and keep moving forward. This is what has been taught by the Mukti Bahini's effort in the 1971 war. Mukti Bahini, what does it mean? It means a force, a strength for liberation, for freedom, for independence. That was a rightful force to stand up for the first time against the Pakistani military and say that we will not take this anymore. We will not go through this again and again. We will never, ever forgive you for what you did to our women, our children, and to our people on the 25th of March at 11 p.m. to crush the rightful rebellion of the Bengali people against the oppression of the Pakistani government in Bangladesh. The Pakistani armed forces launched their heinous Operation Searchlight. The first attack was launched at Dhaka. Dhaka was crushed. It had a bloodbath on their streets. People died by the thousands. Eventually, the other cities in Bangladesh were falling prey to the Pakistani military. They started capturing the towns. The local people, these volunteers started fighting them. These volunteers rose up. They were just normal people like you and me, students, professors, farmers, shopkeepers, businessmen, children, the elderly. They started rising up. They started establishing barricades, digging trenches, started gathering weapons from police stations, from army areas, and they started fighting them. Unfortunately, they didn't have the training. The Pakistani military was extremely superior in all cases. But alongside them rose a few heroes. These heroes were Bengali officers in the Pakistani military and in the Pakistani paramilitary forces. They were serving in East Pakistan at that time. They were serving in the army cantonments. And when they heard what the Pakistani army did to the people, they rose in rebellion. They started defecting. These officers were in many places and they all started defecting in their own places, in whichever way they could, with their own companies, with their own battalions. Entire battalions defected from the East Bengal Regiment. From the East Pakistani Rifles, entire wings had defected. Bengali policemen, Bengali Ansars started defecting and they joined the public. In many places, they started leading the public in these rebellions, in these uprisings. Meanwhile, the Pakistani military atrocities were growing wherever they had gone. They not only started killing innocent civilians, they started raping women and children. They started burning down houses. They started looting. They wiped out entire villages. And unfortunately, the initial Mukti Bahini defense of these Bengali servicemen and Bengali people had fallen. These were dark days in the months of April and March. With the failure of these defenses, unfortunately, the Mukti Bahini had to move to India. They had to abandon the towns, the villages and the cities that they had been defending so much. They had taken a lot of casualties in a lot of places. Retreating to India, it was the Indian armed forces and the Bengali servicemen who started training willing volunteers in the refugee camps and willing volunteers who had crossed the border to fight for their rightful liberation. With all of these training, the Mukti Bahini started hitting them back. The Mukti Bahini started launching guerrilla offensives instead of face-to-face fighting like conventional warfare. It started leading the Pakistani armed forces like an elephant who had fallen into a trap. A bleeding Pakistani army started helping the Mukti Bahini to gather more weapons, more information, and more details about the atrocities they were committing. Hence, reprisals by the civilians in many places started happening against the Pakistani forces. The Pakistani forces were now bogged down in a war of attrition. The Pakistanis didn't get help. They received American weapons, they received Chinese weapons, and they also received a volunteer force named as the Razakars. These heinous Bengali people supported the military occupation of Pakistan in Bangladesh. And I'm referring to this as an occupation because an occupation sucks the very life out of the civilian population who are oppressed in that place. The Pakistani military didn't do anything different. The Mukti Bahini was the only answer to all of this. The guerrilla offensives were becoming very effective by the month of August. Operation X destroyed the Pakistani Navy's forces to retaliate anymore on the Eastern Front. This did give an opportunity to India because India thought that if the Indian armed forces had to retaliate against Pakistan and liberate Bangladesh, one threat like the Pakistani Navy's elimination could be extremely effective. Operation X in the month of August did that very well. The Mukti Bahini naval commandos, alongside help from the Indian Navy, destroyed Pakistan Navy's ability to fight in Bangladesh. With atrocities launched on civilians, the Army League leadership had fled to India. Alongside them, top-ranking Bengali army officers had also fled. The leadership of the Mukti Bahini was led by Colonel M.A.G. Osmani. Osmani had served in the Pakistani army, but he knew how the Pakistanis were treating Bengalis. Osmani knew their faults, and Osmani proved extremely important for the Indian armed forces to gather more intel about the enemy inside Bangladesh. Colonel Osmani and the other sector commanders of Bangladesh was divided into 11 sectors. These 11 sector commanders now started leading the Mukti Bahini offensives inside the country. This mixture of Bengali civilians, armed forces personnel, and paramilitary forces now started to think about a stronger offensive against the Pakistanis. By the month of September 1971, it was clear that with the rising strength of the Mukti Bahini, they could launch serious offensives in much greater strengths against the Pakistanis. Hence, the Mukti Bahini High Command decided to form 3 infantry brigades. The Z-Force Infantry Brigade was formed at Tura under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Ziaur Rahman. The S-Force was formed under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Shafiullah, and the K-Force was formed under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Khalid Musharraf. All of them later became generals in the Bangladesh military. Before the formation of these infantry brigades, the Mukti Bahini offensives had liberated some of the border areas inside Bangladesh, some of the enclaves, some villages, and they did take part in some revenge assaults against the Pakistanis and the Razakars. But now, these 3 brigades started taking territory back from Pakistan. The Indian Army started supporting them with artillery and of course with weapons and ammunition and training. Also, the Indian Armed Forces and the Mukti Bahini High Command decided to train officers. The first batch of Bangladesh Army officers in Murti. These people came from the civilian population mostly, and one of the first batch of these Bangladesh Army officers was Second Lieutenant Sheikh Kamal himself, the son of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. In the month of November and December, with the Indian Armed Forces coming in full force against the Pakistani army, the Mukti Bahini started taking large amounts of territories like the Belonia Bulge, the other border outposts which were strongly held, and liberated many big towns. They also started aiding the Indian Army since the official declaration of the war on the 3rd of December 1971 war. They were the main guides for the Indian Armed Forces when they started entering Bangladesh. And of course, the Indian Armed Forces were operating deep inside Bangladesh before the month of December and November, and it was these Mukti Bahini people who took them to these places for the operations, who guided them, who gave information about the strength of Pakistanis, the exact details about the enemy. Without the help of the Mukti Bahini, then the Indian Armed Forces would have had a much tougher time in Bangladesh. After the Indian Armed Forces had vacated Bangladesh, it was all up to the Mukti Bahini to maintain law and order inside Bangladesh. They did get their due freedom but it was at a huge cost of blood and sacrifice. Many of them not only lost their lives, they lost their limbs, they returned back wounded, some of them lost their sanity, and most of them lost their homes. Yes, when they were out to fight for the liberation of Bangladesh, the Pakistani armed forces and the Razakars did take a note of that. They found them out and they found out their families. A lot of their families faced terrible reprisals in the hand of these goose-stepping Pakistani forces. It was a horrible time for them. Yet, with a lot of sacrifice, they had earned their rightful place in history and their rightful place in this world. Thank you for listening, and do like and subscribe to my channel.